All right, my name is Dustin, and I'm with 10 Pound Gorilla. Today we are going to talk about Too Sexy inside of DNN and using Webpack to organize and optimize the app when paired with Bootstrap, Sass. Probably won't touch much on TypeScript, but images, Tailwind and stuff like that can compile and basically optimize all your files for production ready, and then you have your development files. So we will sort of go over that. We've covered a little bit of this in past meetings, which I reference in here too. So those lead into this, and I might cross over in talking about some of those things that either Paul or maybe it was Gabe and Laura also on Tailwind and Webpack. So we sort of have an understanding of what Webpack is based on Paul's previous meeting, but Webpack is sort of a way that you can use different plugins. And I probably am not going to do the best at explaining it to process and compile different tasks that do, I guess, different things that can optimize your files, can spin up a dev server, can minify your files. So like various different things. So like with VS Code, I realized I use a lot of VS Code plugins that then when I started getting into Webpack, I ended up using all of Webpack's plugins to do a lot of the things that I was using VS Code's plugins to do. But it becomes centralized to your project, and then your project sort of outlines all the files and plugins that you use. So it becomes more project-based rather than VS Code, sort of like your entire VS Code. So we're going to go over ways to install and configure it. And so in the past meetings, we probably touched about more of an overview of what Webpack is. I'm going to get into how you really install and set this up in VS Code, and how, and once you do this once, you basically won't have to do it again that many times for other projects, because you can just reuse it and then modify or change what packages you might use for that particular project or app. So the initial setup might seem a little cumbersome at first, but it's not something that you have to repeat multiple times. So what we're going to do is we're going to install Tailwind, we're going to install Webpack in loaders. We're going to install some other packages and plugins. And then we're going to configure some config files and sort of go through what those mean and what the settings within those configurations are doing for Webpack, PostCSS, and Tailwind. I included TypeScript in here, but I didn't do anything with it. If we ever get into TypeScript or anybody wants to use it, it seems something that would be beneficial to use because of how it's error checking and type checking, and since I haven't specifically used it, I can't overly explain the benefits, but Too Sexy has moved into typed code that very much resembles TypeScript, so it would be a parallel with how Too Sexy's new code is being written in Razor and typed. And then I have some links here to the other presentations that reference more information. So I've set up a demo project. It is in Bitbucket, but I'm going to go through sort of all this from scratch. One thing I'm doing here is I'm deleting these files that get generated into the distribution folder, so that you'll see how they just come back. So in this sort of basic setup, you could pretend that this is sort of like a Too Sexy app. I did put it into the content app, and what we have here is a source folder and a distribution folder. Everything that I'm going to be working or modifying from is going to be in the source folder. The distribution folder is what gets compiled when I run the Webpack. So when I build this out. So let's see. One thing, and I'll go back and forth here, is that we're going to install Node. You guys probably have this installed, but if you don't, you can open up terminal, and you can type in, what was it? Node-V, and if you have it installed, it's going to give you the version number that you have installed. And then if you have npm installed, you can go npm-v, and then it'll tell you if it's installed. If you don't have that installed, you're going to need to install Node. And I have some instructions over here to do that. I'm not going to go through that because I already have it installed. And then you can install npm if you don't have that. But that's the Node package manager that allows you to install packages. Then once you have that installed, you're able to install Tailwind and these other packages. I've already done this, but this to outline it is like if we just wanted to install Tailwind, that will just do Tailwind. Then if we want to do Webpack, I can do all these at one time. So what this is doing is it's installing Webpack, it's installing Webpack CLI, it's installing the dev server, a style loader, CSS loader, post CSS loader, and a post preset environment. And I'll go through sort of what those do. So the post CSS loader allows you to load other plugins like the preset.env. So that's sort of a requirement. It's needed. We use that in our config file to load some of the plugins that are used. This post CSS preset-env isn't necessarily necessary, but it allows newer, less supported browsers. So it allows you to basically use more modern CSS features that may not be cross-browser supported yet. And then it, during the compilation, finds ways to compile that to browsers that can read whatever code will accomplish that task, as from my understanding. Auto prefixer does vendor prefixes. It seems very commonly used within Tailwind, Webpack, and all this. Again, I don't know that it's necessarily required, but seems to be worth using. And even in Tailwind's documentation, I think they include it. I could be wrong. Style loaders use a CSS loader. I didn't get too deep into reading this, but it fixes some things that can't compile either within Tailwind with the @important in URL. I sort of will go over that when we create our like main skin.sas file that we use in our theme folder that imports all of our other CSS files. This is sort of needed in order to work with Tailwind to allow you to import Tailwind's base files within a SAS file like that. Now, if you were just using Tailwind, you may not need that, but in this case, we do. Track here. So you can run this whole thing and that'll install everything. And then once that's installed, we sort of are ready to start creating the configuration. And that's walking through these config files. And I'm just going to go over here to those files. So in the Tailwind config file, we've talked about this in some past presentations. This is in compilation. If you use Tailwind with Webpack, you don't have to use Webpack. You could just use Tailwind. So this is sort of based off of using it with Webpack, but can be used independently. And I'm going to show you how that can be run. The thing here that what this is doing is it's looking for the content and this is something I was playing with prior to the meeting, that I'll touch base on later, but we're basically looking in the distribution folder where I'm going to store, say, my default skin file, or maybe my default HTML files for the app that I'm going to want to compile Tailwind against to check the classes, or it could be CSS in here as I added that. So it can scan the CSS check to see if there's any CSS classes that it needs to output to then compile to the CSS file. So that's the most important thing here. And then the other thing that this is required is if you do use any of Tailwind's plugins, to include those here. I do include, I guess I didn't do it here, some sample files in our Bitbucket. Oh, I did here, that you can reference to copy the project, or this project will be accessible for us as well. The post CSS config, a few things. You can create these config files automatically. So if I came in here after I installed Tailwind and did npx Tailwind CSS initialize, it's going to create this file if it doesn't already exist in my project. And if you do this, it'll create the post CSS config. The Webpack config, you can create that file using Echo. You can create any file using Echo, and then right bracket or arrow and then the file name, and then it'll create the file depending on what folder you are in the terminal. So once those files are created, then we just have to configure them. The post CSS file, all this is doing is loading that Tailwind CSS to make sure it checks and then scans those files to then process the CSS. And within the post CSS file, then we go to the Webpack, and the Webpack is referencing all of this to run. So when we run something, we're actually running it through Webpack that then runs the post CSS and Tailwind config. And in here, some of the important things are the entry and output. And Webpack, we're saying, well, what files are we going to check, and then where are we going to output? In this case, we're checking the SAS file, and the way that this is tokenized allows you to run different types of things. So in my package.json, which this will get created automatically for you every time you install a plugin for your project or a dependency or something, that's going to get added automatically to these files. So it sort of is like a manifest file that tells you what your project contains and what is it using. And in here in this script, we're basically get to tell that Webpack what to run. So when we looked at Webpack and we said this style, well, what style are we referencing? That's being pulled from here. So I can come in here and say, I want style to be custom, or that could be a custom CSS or whatever. But in this case, in this example, I'm using it as the styles one. But if you had multiple CSS files or multiple import files and you didn't want to build against the entire project, you can build against that specific file. And that's what this is doing. And then I even have a build here that's Tailwind only and doesn't use the Webpack. It basically is just looking at the Tailwind config file and running it. So in which case, when we run this, and I'll do that in a second, it will then output into our distribution folder the files. So what is it outputting? Well, it's going to output some CSS, and it's going to output any JS files that are needed. In our styles that this is actually checking to run the compile, it is all of our Bootstrap calls. And this one I've set up outside of the theme. So we would be referencing only the functions or things that we need to build the CSS for this particular app. in this example, but this could be our themes import file as well. You can, by having node modules, I didn't touch on that. I'll get back to that. We're not installing Bootstrap like we normally do within our theme. We're just installing Bootstrap as a node module and then referencing Bootstrap from there, rather than actually having all the files inside of our theme that are that we don't need. We just need them to compile against. We don't need them to live inside the theme. But if you wanted to reference, say, the variables from your theme, I could take this one out and then, you know, say, update this to the boilerplate theme or whatever and reference our variables from there that we've created from the theme. So if I was trying to access our variables from the Too Sexy app to our theme, I could uncomment out this line and hook those variables into to get passed into this process. And then the Tailwind, in order to do the import, Tailwind needs to be like this. There's other ways you can do it if you weren't doing it as an import, if you were doing Tailwind only, and I think that might be in Laura's presentation. But this is if you're doing a Tailwind as an import, and it's not the very, very first thing in your file. I can't remember, there was something about that you had to do it a certain way. So I think this can be written two different ways. So if you see this written differently, that's why. So now when I run this, I'm going to run this style and it's going to go scan these files. And then, well, actually what it's doing is it's checking this index.js file is the only file it's checking. And then it's checking to whether I want to run the styles one. I think by that env, I think I did a very bad job of explaining this. Anyways. Hopefully it's sort of making sense.
And Dustin, I mean, can I encourage the group to ask questions too? Because I will say, since I don't code, this is way over my head, but I want to make sure that we're getting, because I think Dustin has a lot of good content here.
Well,
we're asking questions so that you guys are understanding what he's communicating if you're not.
I'm trying to over-explain things. So in short, because what's going to happen here is now this package, all I'm trying to do is eventually run something, and I want to run the Webpack. And that Webpack is being run from this Webpack config, and then I'm telling it what I want to run. So right now I want to build it. The dev actually spins up a dev server because I'm using a dev server plugin, but the build actually builds my package. So if I go npm run build, it's going to run this, and then you can see that it's running Webpack and it's running based off of this environment, which is the styles. And then as it runs this in this distribution folder, you'll see that these files got created, including an image file, which is optimized and compressed. And it also builds a cache, a caching system, which I need to sort of read about. I don't fully understand what that's doing, but I think it's relative to performance in some manner. And that might be dev performance. I don't know if it's used in production, but now those files are built. And when I look at this, this is compiled. Not only did it compile Sass, it compiled Bootstrap, anything that I use from Bootstrap. It then compiled anything that was in my HTML file markup. So like I used the class pros, I used this DNN red, I used a gradient. These are all Tailwind classes. So if we look here, it only compiled the ones that I used in that HTML file. If it was not used, it will not compile. So I can see DNN Red, Slate. These are some of my customs. It also compiled any custom CSS I put into another file that I included. I even took my variables file and I didn't apply from Tailwind. So I took a bootstrap class and I applied a Tailwind class to it. So what did that do? So now if we look at, where did that go? Secondary. It created that button secondary with Tailwind's CSS. So, and it does this really fast and optimizes the code and puts in all these comments and everything. So really what this Webpack and Tailwind and Combo and Post CSS is doing is it's really taking only the necessary CSS and only the necessary JavaScript and compiling it. So it also compiled the JavaScript and oh, it didn't minify it. Did not have that minify on? I must have changed. I must have turned something off that it didn't minify it. But it will look for any CSS that's used in your JavaScript that might be Tailwind based, and then include that in the CSS file as well. So if I came in here and I had some class that I specified of Tailwind and it was only in my JavaScript file, that will then get output in the CSS file. The image, little less understandable about how this is being done or what's causing it, but it sees that I use this image in my CSS file. It sees that that image exists in my image folder. Now this could have existed in any folder in source. It didn't have to be in the images folder. And then it outputs it as with a unique file name. I think, again, I don't know why it's creating that unique file name, but something to do with performance and cache. Now, if I came back in to my custom CSS and I remove this image, let's just say, I save this file and I can run this again. But now that that image file doesn't exist in my CSS, it's not called, and it's not called in any HTML file anywhere, it's not going to get added to my distribution folder. So it's like, well, that's an image isn't being used. So one thing that's good about that is if you are really organized and over the course of time, you maybe used this icon or maybe you used this logo file, and then they had logo version 2 and logo version 4, but all those image files still existed in your project. Well, if you were using Webpack and you output the production ready build, if you no longer use those files and they didn't exist in any of your files, it won't get output into the production. So even if it lived in your development files, it's sort of cleaning up any unnecessary stuff for you. So as you can see now, that ran and there is no image that gets created. So it just knows that that image isn't being used. So there's no point in parsing it, or I don't even know what the right word is that it's doing. So I thought that was pretty nice to have, or you know, I didn't expect to come across that when I was testing this, and sort of did. So something to look into a little bit more. Sort of went through this, but let's see. We need to create those files at first if they don't exist, and then we need to set up those files. This has some instructions on what you need to set up. You can create your project folders, sort of like your dev environment folders, your source folders, however you want, but typically you might call it source, and then we'd have a CSS, a JS. You might have a images folder. You might have a fonts folder because Webpack also does font processing. and any other assets that you might contain in your project, much like how our theme's built. And then you'd have the distribution folder that's only used to output the files for the build. What I didn't touch on, where I lost a little bit of track, was that index.js file. That's actually the file that the Webpack is looking at to then go and scan. So when I create that index.js file, I then am importing both the CSS and JS together, and then running the Webpack against that so that it builds both the JavaScript and the CSS. Now I could just point it at the CSS and it would just generate the CSS, or I could just point it at the JavaScript and not import the CSS and it would just generate the JS. So again, that's all down to however you set up your production file or your package file in your scripts here. I can keep adding more of these, and I could call it, Dustin if I wanted to, and call this Webpack the style equals, let's just call it tailwind only.css. What did I miss? Oh. So now if I ran this npm run Dustin, it's going to run just the tailwind only CSS and then compile. So now the file that it produced this did it produce everything? And this is sort of new to me, so it looks like it's exactly the same. It didn't do anything different. Oh, it gave me an error. That's why. Yeah. So my Webpack doesn't like running that, so which makes sense. I'm surprised it even attempted to output it, but that's because it's looking for this, a SAS file and an index file, and I didn't do either. So doing this in the environment style in this case doesn't work because I'm not including the index.js file. So, but if I adjusted that, you could run just tailwind only or something, another CS only file. It doesn't have to be a SAS, it doesn't have to be JS. The point is that you can have multiple ways to run things, and you can create these for whatever you want to run. So like the build TW, this one actually is because I'm not using the Webpack here. So this is probably what I should have showed you as an example, is that this doesn't use Webpack at all. I'm not feeding it that. I'm only telling it to use the Tailwind CSS. So when I do that, it will just build the Tailwind from this source file. That's it. It's the only file it's going to look at, and it's going to output that file, and then it's going to minify it. And there's that file. So these are the bad ones from before.
I'm kind of picturing those different development environments. I can't remember if it was Paul or maybe Aaron Lopez in a previous video that we talked to him about Tailwind, but there's a way you can develop with Tailwind where it just has everything loaded by default, and it allows you to do very active development, right? So you're not compiling every time you're making changes to your code. So you might have an environment for that. You might have an actual development where you're doing your compilation and then reviewing everything, and then you have maybe your like QA environment where you do your final like compilation and minification and compression, and then validate all of those changes before ultimately deploying to production. So there's being able to have those processes kind of predefined and ready to go, and just cycle between them as you're doing your development would be pretty nice to have organized.
Yeah, so, and that's a better way than I'm explaining it, Chris. In that dev, so like the dev one that I'm running here, as you can see, I didn't even open this. I just typed that into the terminal. It's spinning up a local environment for me and loading the page. So it's building it right now on the fly, as you see that. This was supposed to be the 10-pound gorilla logo, but I removed that from the code. But where did that go? Oh. So yeah, so right now, like I ran that dev, it's running. So if I made changes to any of my files, it's live, and it'll reflect those files on that server. So I don't have to run this every time. Yeah, you wouldn't run the build all the time. You could just run this dev, work from a dev, and it'll compile and feed in all that stuff. And then when you're ready, you can do your build. So yeah. What is stock? Let's see. Yeah, we sort of went through that. This index.html file, I mean, we sort of touched on that. This is in the distribution folder. It just is what the Tailwind is scanning and looking for. So anything that you're telling your Tailwind config file to check HTML files, JS files, CSS HTML files, when you build, is going to check all those files to see if any classes are used and build them. The scripts sort of touched on that. You'll typically have a dev and build, and you might have some other ones for testing, like Chris did a better job of explaining. And the run packages, we talked about that. The images, the scripts, the styles, those all get outputted. So really the goal of all this is to really improve development time and optimization of the code, and reducing any unused CSS that doesn't really need to be loaded on a page when the page is being viewed. Tailwind configuration is very good at that and allows you to do that. Calling in only the bootstrap like we do in our theme, but then we'll often use that for every single page on our site. And I know I've talked about this in the past where we could get specific with our Too Sexy apps that this CSS is only being loaded when that app lives on that page, and using Webpack within those apps would help achieve that. Using that SAS import file to where you're only importing the Bootstrap SAS components that you need if you're using Bootstrap. And then, you know, on top of all of that, it's just doing a lot of good optimization on your code, from the JS to the CSS, with the auto prefixers, with some of the some of the things it does for JS, and I don't know if it's doing it just for the cache or whatever, but I noticed that it'll wrap your JS in like strict mode, or it'll put some caching thing around it on different compiles. So whatever some of these things are actually doing, I'm not the best to explain, but I can just see that they're doing things that are performance based and optimization based. So they're just really optimizing your files. I don't know why this didn't get minified.
It looked like that config build file, only one of those had a dash minify.
Oh, did it? On the package?
Yeah.
Well, this has dash minify. This Webpack serve didn't need that because it gets minified anyways, because in my, I'm using this mini CSS extract. Well, actually, I don't know if that's what's doing it. I don't know. It was when I was doing this earlier, but I played around with this a lot just to see what everything was doing. It was minifying it. I'd probably just change something. But yeah, the node modules, I guess I didn't really touch on that, but when you have these node modules installed, like instead of having Bootstrap in our theme, I've installed Bootstrap SaaS, wherever it is at. Yeah, so like I'm pulling from there rather than in a node module, which then doesn't get pushed to the server or anything, doesn't get pushed to our repositories. It just is something that we can access. So you can have a node module font awesome, a node module for, they have a lot of them. So a lot of different packages is that we can then leverage to then build our code from. And I think using node modules is very handy, to say the least, and quick.
Keeping the code off the server when it's not needed is pretty nice, just from a using of resources. I think also like being able to download that library that you want to use and get it into your code and ready to go is quite a bit faster than going to Bitbucket or Bootstrap, downloading the source code, putting it into your directory and doing that manually.
Yeah, and then you can uninstall. So I can go npm oops. One thing I want to touch on is that I'm in the content folder and I installed node modules in the content folder. If you do that, and I did that because this is inside of a 2Sexy app, you'll want to make sure you're in an integrated terminal to where you're in the content folder when you're running something. If you're trying to work with Node or whatnot, you want to make sure you're in the right folder. But if I came in here now and did uninstall, what is it, Bootstrap? I can now, run that and it'll uninstall it or install it. And so it's pretty quick, and you can go and uninstall and install things and change your mind or whatnot. Again, even though I have all these node modules installed, your package JSON file sort of figures out which ones you're using and your dependencies. So that Bootstrap didn't get updated, but I think the next time I don't know. Does anybody know? Does this get changed? It might be seeing this as a dependency because I'm importing it, but I'm guessing I'll get an error now. I thought it would have fixed that file. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, it is. It was just cached, so it's gone. So Bootstrap's gone now. And then when I compiled it, I get an error. So, and then it tells me that Bootstrap's not installed. So I think the information that you get from, the terminal in these cases and running these builds also helps you troubleshoot. So there's just a lot of things in the terminal that you can get for your project from errors to code to what your project requires. That's helpful when using Webpack. So, and then if I wanted to install Bootstrap, I just npm I bootstrap install. And you can do different versions if you wanted to. So like you could do @ and then like a version number. I don't know what they are, but you can install a certain version if you wanted to test against it. So that's sort of it on that. As far as how you would get Tailwind to check like a too sexy component where you were to use some sort of razor variable to output the value, well, it's not going to see that variable as a string that is a Tailwind class, so that there's no way to scan those files and check. I started thinking about this a little bit, and I think it's possible to access, and I think you saw that in my Tailwind config file at the beginning, is that there are all of 2Sexy's content and data is accessible through their web API. I'm not logged in, maybe that was why. And I don't know, you probably have to make it public. I don't know yet how you would really compile against some sort of razor variable with Tailwind.
Are you looking at
ahead of time?
Are you looking at not in the template code, but in like your content types? You create a drop down with 5 different button styles, primary, secondary, tertiary, so on. How do you get Tailwind to recognize those so it compiles the code for them?
Well, and I just don't know that this is necessarily a problem or needed, but so we can have it scan all the folders, like the 2Sexy folder, and scan this HTML. But yeah, anything that you have is like a variable here. There's no way for Tailwind to then go check that, see what that variable was that was used, and then compile the CSS. But how often are we giving the user choices to style a button that we wouldn't just always have included in our CSS? Or style anything within 2Sexy that would be variable based that you would want or care to have Tailwind and compile. So I just don't know that this is a huge necessary thing to worry about. I think any classes that you were to do, so like in this case, I was messing around with the icon thing. So like putting in a Tailwind class like BG Purple or something. And okay, now that this has been used and they've saved that, how can we check that variable is used to then, produce that CSS? The only way I could think of is that there's this JSON, so it produces it. This is an API, and if we have it checking, I think that, I don't know for sure. I think it might be possible that you can create some sort of, it'd probably be like an Aaron or Mark thing, or I'm not sure, to create the check to scan these API files or these JSON files of all the data that live in the database to then go see if these classes were used. Because this class is outputted, it's a string, and Tailwind is capable of checking this. So
I'm picturing a pretty, it might be a gross way to do it, but you create a template file that just lives in your code that says like 2Sexy variations, and then you have the predefined classes, basically like almost like a markdown file that shows these are the different button options for this component. You can do a left and a right variation. These have 2 different classes that we know we need to compile. but it has long-term management considerations around it. But like you said earlier, I don't know how often we would run into a problem where you're building in a variation or a variable that someone can work in through Too Sexy that you wouldn't already have a style or a class built for.
Yeah,
I don't know.
that's what I think. I looked at Aaron did a Tailwind presentation video. I think at one of the summits a couple of years ago. The video has some outdated information in it, but still has a lot of good info. I mean, the way Aaron from Wolf X Machine works is like he literally builds sort of like, I think, Gabe, you've done a lot, and maybe other people do, where you build everything in your HTML files first. So he literally has what he calls like his distribution folder, but his development folder is like all HTML files of all of his Too Sexy stuff, which he then copies over and converts to CSHTML, but he builds his Tailwind from his HTML files.
I think, Laura, you do something similar when you're coding your components, right? You'll build it out as HTML. You'll have usually like a standalone section where you can run it locally, access it, test it, validate it, whatever, and then you start to integrate with Too Sexy at some point.
Yeah, that's normally what I do. I normally have like an HTML directory, which is just static files testing the markup and CSS classes.
And that helps during the development side of things because you aren't necessarily needing to implement it into DNN and Too Sexy and then continually deploy and upload to the server where we're running on. You can build it all locally and then upload your final code changes and then start to integrate.
Yeah.
I have a related question. So when using Webpack to strip unused classes, did you happen to see a way to define exceptions to that process? Because, like, for example, in our boilerplate right now, we have a DNN fixes file that targets DNN classes that would not appear in our templates because they're generated by DNN. And I feel like that would just get stripped during the process if it doesn't see it in any of the files. Is there a way to prevent that from happening?
Well, and like, so those things that you can force to, like Tailwind is the only thing that's getting checked. So if those aren't Tailwind classes, so those are going to get output no matter what. So like my custom classes here that says hello, this isn't a Tailwind and Blue Apple's not. When it compiled it, it is compiling hello no matter what. And these aren't used. This isn't in HTML, so those get compiled no matter what. The only thing that it's checking is whether a Tailwind class is being used or not. So if I came in here and put in DNN Red 700 into my custom CSS, but what was it, Red 700, background, I don't know, black. And I did that, but I didn't have it. Like, I didn't have DNN Red in here anywhere. Or it will still compile it.
So that DNN Red 700 should show up regardless if it's being used or not because it's a custom non-Tailwind specified.
Well, I've actually made this a Tailwind, but then I put it into this custom, which is a CSS file. So I don't know, because this will be a check, because I think it might be checking and it might remove this because it's not used, but let's find out. But if it's not a Tailwind CSS class, it would not get removed like the ones above it. But I do think that if it was a Tailwind class, you put it in a custom CSS file, and then no HTML is using it, it's not going to compile it, or I don't think it should. It did, but it might be because we're not scanning the CSS files in the Tailwind config. But so like in here, okay. So yeah, so then if I just did what dot CSS in this case. Yeah, you're right.
You might want to add SCSS to that too.
I did have a question about the deployment process. When you get done compiling, it's building that distribution folder. Does the distribution folder, and this is me not knowing anything about Webpacks, normally, or Webpack, does it generate the scaffolding for you to upload? Sorry, looks like it did finish compiling.
It did finish. Does it, the scaffolding meaning?
Yeah, so like when you're building for Too Sexy, you have kind of like your root directory of the app or the content type that you're building where all of your CS/HTML files live, and then you might also have subdirectories where you place your JavaScript, CSS, and images.
Yeah, so you could do that, and that's through your Webpack config file. So, and that's where you could get this to be more advanced. So this output, I did put it in, for simple sake, I put it there, but I could say, you know, I think it was like environment or something, the way he had it written. I took some of this from like the blog app. But you can create a path so that like all the JavaScript files then get output to a JS folder, all the CSS get output to a CSS folder, and stuff like that within your distribution. And then within your distribution folder, you would store, these wouldn't be getting built. You would actually they would live there all the time, which would be your CS/HTML files. So like this index would be like my, CS/HTML file if I wanted to. And then you'd have all your Too Sexy app files or template files in this distribution folder. The only thing that would be getting generated would be your CSS, your images, fonts, or JS.
Got it. And then you could still realistically build like a monitor to check for changes, deploying them to your dev environment. So if you are going through that iterative process in dev, you can still have kind of that automation built into uploading, checking, and refreshing your page.
Yeah, I think you'll find that, and I don't know exactly your process, Chris, but that you'll find that using Webpack, and if you get familiar with that config file and get good at those config files, you probably can do a lot more than I'm even capable of explaining right now, and don't feel like I do the best job of explaining. But I spent quite a bit of time looking at the Webpack, looking at all these different modules, going, geez, there's so many. How do you know what's being used and what's going on? But at a very, very basic level, just using the node modules for Bootstrap would be an improvement of just taking our Bootstrap SaaS out of the boilerplate theme and start using node modules, and then using either maybe it's just post CSS, maybe you don't use Webpack, because all these things do different things. They don't all have to be used. So you could just use Tailwind and post CSS, or you can use Webpack with it, but you can compile based off that. So rather than like I was using a plugin that was compiling all my SaaS for me, I don't need to use that anymore because I'm just using Webpack to do that in the terminal. And then some of the plugins like post CSS plugins are doing some of the processing of the SaaS, processing of the minification and all that stuff that otherwise I'd be using VS Code plugins for. So like look further down in this file here, you have the post CSS loader and it's loading in the Tailwind. And then you have a SaaS loader. So like I'm not going to do the best job of explaining this, but you guys probably will understand it just by looking at it as much as I do, which is this is going through a process of going through these scripts and these plugins and these loaders to load the right plugins in order to accomplish the tasks that it's trying to do, which is, in our case, mostly compiling CSS and JS.
A small enough benefit of this is in the past when we had different developers working with different code editors, so Visual Studio versus Sublime or something like that, the compilers would generate the code at the end result slightly differently, like different spaces or ending tabs and whatnot, and that would cause code conflicts. When you put all of this into Webpack, whenever you download it, it's going to have a consistency across the board, so every developer has the same like compiling process that's running, and all of that logic is bundled within that project. So I think that's pretty cool. And then it also has the ability to change over time. You can use what you need per project, pull out or add as the project needs it. So it's kind of becoming more flexible, I think.
Yeah, well, and just like the access to different things. I mean, I didn't install Font Awesome here, but we probably should just get familiar if Webpack is something that people want to use, get familiar with all the different plugins that they have, and things that we might have used, like CDNs for, or other things for, that we could use these Node, Node.js and the Node modules for quicker development standpoint. It also keeps you up to date too, with knowing what version they are, what version you're compiling against, what version this project's using. So like, I know that this is using Bootstrap 5.3.2 just by looking at this package file. You could, in theory, have an install that installs everything for you, right? So I think you could, and I have to look it up, but if you had this package file, I think you can do like npm install package, and then it's going to check this package, and it's going to go through and it's going to install all the dependencies that you need in order to run the project for you. And then you just are ready to go. So like if you jumped into a project that somebody else worked on and set up, you probably just need the one file to then set up your environment.
Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our Gorilla Learning Lab. We have a lot more banana tidbits for you to get ape over. Check out our other videos or visit our website at www.10poundgorilla.com. I'm swinging on out of here.
Ooh, ooh, ah, ah! Ooh, ooh, ooh! You're not subscribed? That's bananas!